Hello BookTube, it's Leah Cooper here, and today I'm bringing you my September wrap-up. Look at me, actually making content for this channel. I mean, not frequent content, but at least monthly content. Yes. So September was a pretty good month for me. I think it was actually, page-wise, the best month I've had in 2018. Not that that's saying much. I read... Let me check my handy-dandy spreadsheet. I read 2,200 pages and 5 books. So I had one month, I guess, where I read 9 things, but it was a bunch of novellas. So even though I read 9 things, my page count was like 300 pages lower. And I'm going to try to zip through everything that I read. And actually, I'm looking at my reading spreadsheet, and it looks like I did a really good job last month of only reading things that I already owned, except for the audiobooks that I listened to. One of my goals in 2018, which you can see in my 2018 goals video, which I have not done a good job of following, was to read more books that I physically owned. So I own a lot of physical books, and a lot of them I have not read just because I like to buy used books. I just straight up need to read those books to find out if I like them or not. I want to reduce the number of books I own physically and pare it down to just like the books that I already own that I like really want to keep. And that means I have to make an effort to read them. And according to my reading spreadsheet, I've read maybe 15% of the books I've read this year have come from stuff that I own. Everything else has come from the library, so I'm doing really bad at following this goal. So this month, I was like, I'm going to turn this around. First thing I read, and this has been in a previous TBR. Like, this might have been a book that I really wanted to get to in 2017, and I just didn't, and that is Orlando by Virginia Woolf. I read the first half of this several years ago and then never finished it, so I went ahead and I restarted it from the beginning and completely reread it this month. I gave it 3.5 stars. I think it's really good. The stars that were taken off were twofold, and I'll try to go through this quickly. Plot summary for those of you who don't know anything about this book. It was published in 1928 by Virginia Woolf, dedicated to her lover, Vida Sackville West. It's somewhat inspired by Sackville West. It's about a young nobleman living in the Elizabethan era who kind of just lives forever, just never ages, experiences life, does a bunch of different stuff, goes to sleep, and then in like the late Charles II, I want to say, is on the throne, or it's just like after Charles II, goes to sleep, wakes up physically, goes to sleep physically as a man, wakes up as a woman, and then continues living the rest of her life as a woman, because she is. It's generally attributed as being a very early piece of trans fiction. I think this is really interesting and it's really good, and I would suggest people read it. I kind of marked it down because there's a couple things in it that just haven't aged well. I always just kind of cringe when the N-word gets thrown around, or when you've got a lot of like imperial white savior stuff happening in a book, which happens, and then and like people would argue that, well, you know, it's the Elizabethan era or it's the Georgian era or whatever, and it's kind of like, yeah, but I'm not going to read that and not comment on the fact that it hasn't aged well. So that's one thing. Second thing is there's a film that is based off this book. Obviously this is the movie cover. It stars Tilda Swinton, and it's directed by Sally Porter, I think. Sally Porter, I'm almost positive. And I love the movie. I 100% recommend the film. One of the reasons for that is that the film does rush through the second half of this book a little bit. But to be honest, the second half of this book was a little bit dull, and Woolf dwells on certain parts, certain eras, just for a really long time where nothing much is happening. And I know that's just kind of like her style, but man, I was just kind of like, okay, do we really need to talk about the spirit of the century for 50 pages? So I think that some of the choices that were made for the adaptation to kind of streamline parts of the plot were very effective. I also like the ending better. Quick spoiler, Orlando does eventually have a child, but it's a son. so that she can reclaim her title. It was kind of icky in the book. Not the birth or anything, but just like the emphasis on having a son specifically. I don't know. In the film, she has a child who's a girl, and she doesn't reclaim her property, but she visits it. And it's just, I don't know. I liked the ending of the movie better than the ending of this book. So yeah, 3.5 stars, but it's still pretty good. And I think if you're interested in this topic and like historical queer literature, it's a classic and it's pretty good. The next thing I read, and I'll try to speed this up a little bit because man, I talked way too long about Orlando, was The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon. I gave this book 2 stars. It's a YA novel. I think I originally saw it over on Reagan's channel years ago when I first started reading BookTube, and I didn't really know if I liked YA or not, but it was really popular and everyone was reading it, and I found this book for like $3 and it was in perfect condition when I got it. So I was like, okay, sure, I'll read it. And it was supposed to be like, when she talked about it, she described it as being like really complex and having like really complicated world building, and that sounded interesting to me. It sort of has complicated world building, I guess, but like some of it's sort of mushy in the way that YA sometimes likes to cut corners with its world building. Some of the world building was also kind of eye-rolly because it was done, like it was occurring, the way it was done, like the way things were named in this book, they were being named and spoken about. Like there's nothing written in the book, like, but I'm reading a book, which means I experience what's happening as words on a page, but the characters are experiencing it as words being spoken. And the way like certain things were named in this book only work if they're being read on the page. If they're being spoken, it's kind of nonsense. And I just don't think anyone thought about that. It was just kind of like, okay. So it's a conceit that only works because it's literally a book, not real, and that kind of breaks the immersion for me. The characters were hideously boring, fairly paper thin. The protagonist was just bleh. There was this gross sort of romance you see coming a mile away, and you're just like, oh, please don't kiss your slave owner. But you did. I'm ambivalent towards it. It's like 500 goddamn pages. I will not be continuing with the series, but hey, it's been on my bookshelf. I've read it. It can now go out the door. So hooray! Would I suggest it? No. I've read better. Next thing I read was The Passion of Tuileries by Julie Berry. I listened to this on audiobook. Julie Berry also wrote The Scandalous Sisterhood of Prickwillow Place. It took me a second to remember that, which I listened to earlier in the year and really loved. So I just picked this up. Didn't really know what it was going to be about, and I loved it. I gave it a 5 stars. That might be a little bit generous, but I really quite enjoyed it. It's about 14th century French countryside, kind of during the period of change between the religious crusades and the religious inquisition. Not quite the height of the Inquisition, but still like it's very prevalent, very strong, about a young woman named Dulce who is a Catholic mystic persecuted by the church, sentenced to be executed by fire, and flees and runs away and is eventually found by Batia, who's our main narrator character. She is one of 3 sisters who lives in a small seaside village. She is the local matchmaker. Her sisters run a tavern and read fortunes, and she finds Dulce and decides to protect her and take her home with her and take care of her. And it causes a lot of trouble for her because the Inquisitors are looking for Dulce and chasing after her to stamp out heresy. It's just a fantastic novel. It's really good. If you read it, be sure in my edition at least, there was an extra chapter at the end where the author just talks about the historical context of the book and stuff that inspired her and informed the shape of a lot of the characters and the plot and everything, and it was fantastic. Be sure and read that stuff at the end. If you're interested in history, and like if you're not interested in history, this book's not for you. It's very much solidly a historical fiction novel. I really, really enjoyed it though. It's just great. And it feels really authentic when you're listening to it or when you're reading it. I would also suggest maybe listening to it because the narrators are really good. and there's a lot of foreign words used, and that way you just you have someone pronouncing them for you, and you don't have to worry about how to pronounce a bunch of stuff, you know. So next thing I read finally was The Glasstown Game by Catherine and Valente. This has been in a ton of TBRs that I've made over the last year or so. I pre-ordered this and then I never got around to reading it, but I finally read it. It's a middle grade novel by Catherine and Valente, who's written other things like the Fairyland series, Radiant, Deathless, etc. I really love Valente. I have not read her Fairyland books. This is the first YA book from her that I'd read. I gave it 5 stars. I loved it. It's about the Bronte siblings, so Emily, Charlotte, Anne, and Branwell Bronte, the sisters of who wrote Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, etc. As children, wandering into Glasstown, which is a world based on their toys that it's the world that they play games with in their nursery, essentially, and it's come to life around them. It's fantastic. Like, it's utterly brilliant. I loved it. I suspected I would. Valente included a short story set in this world with these characters in her collection, her short story collection, The Bread We Ate in Dreams, and I read that and loved it too. This is like a prequel to that short story, and it's just phenomenal. Beautiful imagery, charming, difficult. The characters are each very distinctive. If you love middle grade fantasy fiction and you're charmed by like literary illusions, pick it up. It's great. And then the last thing I listened to was The Rogue Not Taken by Sarah McLean, another audiobook. I gave this 2 stars. It was very bland. Like, I was listening to this while I was playing I like to play video games, and like when I'm playing like an MMO like Guild Wars 2, if I'm doing something like farming materials, I'll listen to an audiobook because it doesn't take brain power to run around his own and chop down trees. And that's mostly, I think almost all of this book was listened to while I was doing that or baking, and it wasn't good. Like, I mean, it was fine. I've been reading a lot of historical romance this year, and I think I mentioned this in my last wrap-up. The last Courtney Milan I read wasn't super good, and this reminded me a lot of that, in that there was nothing defining about the characters, especially neither the heroine nor the hero. They weren't interesting. They were just a cobbled together collection of kind of tropes, cliches of historical romance characters. The plot too just was so vapid and shallow, revolving around like nothing but them being in a sketchy situation together and somehow magically falling in love with one another, even though they have nothing in common, no interests or character. I mean, maybe that's, I guess, what they have in common. This one was really this one was just annoying. The conflict involved a lot of miscommunication, but not like believable miscommunication. It was just contrived miscommunication. It also had a lot of there's this thing sometimes heroes will do where they're clearly in love with the heroine, but they've convinced themselves that, oh, I can never love again because I loved someone and then I lost her, or she betrayed me, or whatever. It's the same shit is what it boils down to. And so they repeatedly say, I can't love you, to the heroine, because I can't love you the way you deserve to be loved. And it's just like, fucking get over yourself. Like, it's so unbelievable. It's just so annoying, especially when their thoughts or their statements in the book are extremely repetitive, where they'll just say the same thing over and over and over again. I mentioned that in the Courtney Milan book last month. That happened, where it was just like the same fucking internal monologue for 250 pages. And that was this book too. Especially, it's really obvious listening to it too, when the author like repeats exact phrases, they really start to jump out at you, and you just kind of go, yikes. That needed an edit. Oh, the sex scenes are pretty cringy in this one too. And it wasn't just because I was listening to them. It was more like listening to them really highlighted how cringy they were. So anyways, I was not a fan. This is the second time I've tried to read Sarah McLean, and I probably won't be picking her up in the future. I also think in general, I need a break from historical romance. I've been reading a lot of them because they're candy reads, you know, and I've been in a really bad reading slump this year, and so like candy reads seem like a good idea. But I think I've had my fill of them for a while, and I need to step back and take a break, because the one thing with like kind of generic genre fiction is if the author's not careful, it's really easy for them to blur together. Like if the author doesn't make a lot of effort to have a very interesting plot, they can really blur together, and they're starting to. And I think it's a combination of I've hit a patch of honestly not good historyroms, just reading too many of them in maybe too quick succession. So yeah, that's what I read this month. Pretty good. I've already posted my October TBR, my Spooktober TBR, so I'll link that up wherever that gets linked. Be sure to check that out. Let me know what you read in September. If you've read any of these books, if you're thinking about picking them up, we can have a chat about that in the comments down below. As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoy any of my content, my reviews, my random thoughts on books, be sure and hit that subscribe button. I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye.